Hello, in this video we're going to look at our Hello Content project and specifically how it uses ListVB, ImageVB, and SelectChildVB. So let's start by making sure we have our Hello scene selected and then hitting play. And we actually use a ListVB for this language selection, so we can play around with switching languages. And we also use another ListVB for this character selection, so we can flip around with different characters. This image is brought to you by ImageVB, and we didn't really notice it, but it'll be more noticeable if you run in cloud mode. But there is a connecting screen before you actually get connected, and that's what we use our SelectChildVB for. It's kind of this screen that tells the user we are connecting, basically a preloader. So one cool thing that just happened is because we played the game, we have our data store all filled out. So I can stop playing the game and I still have the data store filled out. And this is important because we bind our view bindings to the data store. So let's open up Canvas, char select, character list, and this is where we see list view binding. And one thing it does is it binds to content.characters. So if we come in here, content characters, we'll notice that it's populated with a list of IDs, Robert, Maria, Sandy, Charles. And if you want to go back and ask yourself, okay, how did that even happen? You can look at our content spreadsheet and you'll see we have a characters sheet and we have those characters. And one thing that's done for you automatically is your content is put into content.sheetName with a list of IDs. So the other thing you'll notice is we have something called a prop mapper. And a prop mapper is going to do a lot of heavy lifting for us. Every list view binding needs a prop mapper to go along with it. And what the prop mapper will do is it will look at the list view bindings variable, and for every item in this list, it's going to create a new game object based on its child. So in this case, button. It's going to create one for each of these guys, Robert, Maria, Sandy, and Charles. And it's going to pass them a props object. And we're telling it how to create that props object. So we're saying content.characters, and then this is a notation that we came up with that just says replace the ID with this. So for the first button, it's going to pass it this object, content.characters.robert. And so that button will have access to name, image, ID, wins, losses, as will all of those items. So, and notice we have this complexity set to simple. That's because we're only creating one props object. So if we look here, we just have this, simple button that we use for each one of these characters, and that button has some code inside our controller. We can look at that real quick. It's select language. So whenever you select character. So whenever you click a button, you're going to send your hello content SO the character you selected, and so it gets set on the server side. And then we have this the button has a child called text, and the text VB basically takes advantage of the fact that props is this guy, content.characters.robert, or whichever character, and it can go into name And if we click into name, there's various values for name, but we want to use the .loc because that means it's localized. So if we come back here and we look at name, it says name is essentially a link to our strings table, and our strings table has a en, es, and fr version, and in code we've created a loc, and we set the localization, and that helps us switch between the different languages. And if you want a closer look at how we did that, it's right here. Sorry, right here. Set language en. So first we start off by setting the language to English, and then we will let you switch it out as you see fit. So now the next thing we're going to look at is that actual language selector. And that's under header. So you saw the code where we set it to English by default. But here again we have a ListVB, and this time it's looking at content.languages. So we have en, es, and fr. So we're basically going to populate buttons with en, es, and fr. And this time our complexity is multi-value. So we're not just passing it the language, but we're passing it text. Text is content.string.language.id. So let's look at that. Content.strings.language, and remember our IDs were populated by content.languages. So let's look at that first. Content.languages, we have en, es, fr. Now we want to look at content strings language and en, es, fr, so that way we're able to pass this as props.text. Okay, props.lang is going to be content.languages.id. So en, es, fr. So if we go down one click, we'll see our button actually uses props.lang.id. So props.lang was one of these, and the ID is en, es, or fr, and it uses that as the ID of the button. But if you go down to the buttons child, it has a text VB, and it's using props.text. So the strings language, this text. So if we run it again, we can take a look at what that looks like. Here we got our text from one place, but we got the contents of the ID that we're actually sending to our button callback from another place, because we were using the props mapper with multi-select. Multi-value versus simple. So now we can go and look at ImageVB. You recall that when you select a character, that image would just update automatically, and it's because we use the ImageVB. It's under Canvas, Card, Photo, and here we have an ImageVB, and our variable is essentially the sprite ID. So hcPlayer.character is going to be set automatically to whatever character was selected. That happens after you select a character. It hits the server object. This is a reference to the server object, and the server object.character field gets set. So now we have a server object.character field, and we can take a look at that. hcPlayer.character, and apparently the last character I set it to was Sandy. So Sandy has an image, and that image has an ID and a sprite, and that's a reference to these sprites that are in our resources. So GalBrush 1 in this case. So the image view binding, super straightforward. And now let's take a look at SelectChildVB. This is a very powerful view binding, SelectChild. So here we have it under Canvas, connecting. And here we're using a pretty simple version. We only have one state. What SelectChildVB does is it will turn on the state depending on what the variable is set to. And here we say our variable is set to this thing called loading. So if we look for loading, loading is set to complete. So there is no complete state, which means this game object essentially doesn't exist. But when loading equals loading, which it does initially until we've set it to loading equals complete, then we're going to show the user the loading state. And the loading state is just some text that says connecting. But we'll have examples of more complicated select child view bindings, but it's just a great way of dealing with multiple states within a server object, causing you to show sometimes very different looking UI. So thank you for your time into checking out ListVB, ImageVB, SelectChildVB. We'll have more on SelectChildVB, but I hope this video helped you see exactly how we could hook it up and understand the prop mapper. Thank you so much. Bye.